And welcome to this video playing Aronian against Carlsen from the Sinquefield Cup St. Louis 2013. And I would like to finish my coverage of the second round by showing you this highly interesting game, which was in terms a surprise, especially of the opening, because Magnus Carlsen is known to be a kind of an opening hopper and to switch openings almost every day. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to see Levin's face when he faced the Dutch defense after the first move d4. So it would be kind of interesting to see that. Knight f3, knight f6. So in a way, the basic setup here is to go for a fianchetto to put the bishop on g2, from which it would exert certain pressure. And if black goes for a stonewall setup to break later on with f3, e4, bringing this very piece to life. And Levin played a slightly different approach, which seems to be an idea which he borrowed from one of his Armenian friends who's also living in Berlin, like Aronian himself. Probably. Bishop f4 is in a way unusual, because after d6 the bishop is already certainly limited and blocked by the pawn here, and one of black's main ideas in this opening here is to push e5, and if white cannot prevent this bishop here will probably just be hit by e5, so he has to try to stop it almost by all means. And one idea here is to play d4, d5 in order to take en passant once the pawn advances to e5. So that's a common theme which we will see in some of the lines here. Okay, e3. And I saw this position on my mobile phone. I was wondering, what about knight h5 here? Isn't this an idea? But when I took a careful look at it, I thought, I don't know. I mean, black's basic plan here is to push e5, and with the pawn on f4 and d4, I think this push somehow loses some of its greatness. Because let's, for example, say after bishop e2 and black takes, because that's the idea of knight h5. Takes and cancel. It's not quite clear. I mean, after knight c6, for example, d5 comes. And d5 is in a way certainly annoying. I mean, this pawn on f4 does a very good job in controlling e5, which is usually the square where the knight would like to go to. And in general, if this pawn structure here is, especially if the e-pawn is still on e7, is preferable for it's advantageous for white, because unending is usually also better if the pawn is taken en passant. At least that's what I was learned by a grandmaster regarding the Leningrad Dutch. So let's say, okay, knight c6 is not that great. So what about knight d7? With the idea that, let's say, if d5 immediately, you can go for takes, and now comes the difference that, okay, I mean, the dark squares here are of course weakened, but I don't see a way white could actually use it, because he doesn't have a dark suited bishop anymore. And the difference compared to knight c6 is that d5 doesn't hit. So here, that d5 doesn't hit the knight. So it's not white who has the initiative, but black can try to seize it himself, playing e5. He doesn't need to care about this threat here against the knight. And I think black gets serious counterplay. I mean, especially if he takes, I mean, these pawns here are very dangerous. Especially if e4 comes, maybe g5, g4, and suddenly a pawn storm is on the way. Might be serious. Of course, if he takes en passant, probably just knight c5, and well, it's white who has to live with this weakness here. these weak pawns. And probably this is just lost here. And yeah, I think black's just better here in these positions. Knight g5 is another idea to try to exploit knight d7, because it certainly stops the bishop from covering the e6 square. And of course, the fork would be a bit annoying. So let's have the knight f6. Here I wasn't sure about d5, but after h6 probably knight f3. White should be black shouldn't be too bad, doing too bad. I mean, after knight d4, of course, e6 is a beautiful square, but otherwise, well, I'm not sure. Much more interesting would have been rook e1, with the idea that after h6, knight f3, knight e4, maybe something like queen c2 and bishop f1. But I think it's a bit too slow here in this position. So maybe starting immediately with rook e1 was the most precise way to getting an opening advantage. And if h6, in order to prevent knight g5, and then bishop f1, for example, knight f6, and now d5, in my opinion, secures an opening advantage for white. I mean, the space advantage is important. This pawn is a weakness right now, and will probably be a weakness for a very long time to come. And yeah, I think it's just black has to solve certain problems. But well, this is just an idea which I had while analyzing this position, and I'm sure Magnus also calculated this idea and sensed that it's not worth going for it. Knight c6 is also quite interesting. I mean, of course, there's this idea by white to play d5 now and to hit this knight. So one could argue whether knight d7 wasn't a better square. But there's a nice tactical point behind d5 now, which is e5. And I mean, it's something that maybe not many Leningrad players might be familiar with, because they don't usually face the setup with bishop f4 that often. But actually, this counter strike with e5 is quite a common theme once the bishop is on f4, because there's tactical point in taking, on e6, taking on f4, and suddenly weaken the structure. So, for example, after d takes e6, e takes f4, c takes b7. Okay, bishop takes, of course, and again after e takes f4. White has won a pawn, but I mean, the bishop is very active now. This knight is still now free to go. The king can castle and maybe put even some pressure here on the king. She has a semi-open b5, so some play is in the position. And I mean, of course, this knight e4 idea is very powerful. Without a dark-squared bishop, the c3 square is quite vulnerable. And once the knight moves and the knight on c3 is eliminated, the pawn on b2 might be a telling weakness. Okay, and here queen e7, for example, is simply, yeah. I mean, it's just better for black. I mean, positionally, it's just dominating, despite the pawn deficit. Okay, queen b3 is an old game which was once played in Augsburg in Germany. Queen b3 is also quite a typical thing which you often face, especially if black castles. And as old saying goes, that in the Dutch, the move black almost would like to beg for is to play f5, f7, so to return this pawn to f7, so that it covers the king. But well, I mean, white was doing quite well in this position. Of course, black's play has certain room for improvement. For example, knight h5, castle long, bishop d7, c5, knight a5, queen a3, hitting the knight, so b6, protecting it, bishop a6, controlling some weak light squares and preventing the knight going back, which in a way already threatens b4 with initiative. So after rook b8, b4, and after b takes c5, as happened in the game Schmidt deal against Renner, 1994, I would suggest simply to take the queen. After which c takes b5, knight d5 is just much better for white. For example, knight takes f4, knight takes f4, and yeah, white should be able to convert the material advantage here quite easily. So instead of that, knight c6, bishop e2 was played, which is in terms a novelty in this position. I mean, it's quite usual and quite, well, natural even, I would say. I mean, one idea of white is simply to allow the e5 push. I mean, it's not easy to prevent it anyway. So yeah. For example, after castle, knight e4, black of course plays to push e4, and if the knight is taken, the knight here has to go. After which e5 is possible, and yeah, would be quite serious. I mean, of course, now the bishop controls e5, the knight controls e5 as well as the pawn does. So e5 is now yeah, is possible within the next move. One other idea, which is also quite typical for this Dutch variation, is to play queen e8 and try to push e5 without allowing a queen's exchange after d takes e, and queen takes d8. So sidestepping this nasty little exchange. But here white has a powerful resource, which is knight d5. And in order to avoid complications which arise after knight takes d5, c takes d5, knight d8, queen b3, or to make it a bit more difficult to develop the bishop after e6 and takes, this pawn here will be simply very weak. I mean, one of those rooks will appear here, double up and pressure the pawn on c7. For example, e6, rook a to c1, the pawn is hanging, queen e7, d takes e, and if bishop takes e5, simply d5. Yeah, the bishop probably has to go back or to f7, and yeah, white simply enjoys more space. So therefore knight d4, and now d5 was interesting. I mean, it's still, I think, even given by the computer, but to be honest, I don't really see the point. I mean, if the knight takes c3, b takes c3, of course bishop takes c3 is just lost, rook c1, and black cannot deal with both hanging pieces. So knight e5, and after rook c1, c5, certainly black has some counterplay, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, instead of, I mean, even in this structure here, I wasn't quite sure if he cannot even spend some time trying to maneuver this one around and maybe play even with the pawn on f4. I mean, this looks anti-positional, maybe it is, but if you try to play e4 and to weaken the structure here after g3 maybe even, so maybe you can even go with bishop to g5 or something like this. This looks quite reasonable. I mean, certainly this bishop has only one target, which is c3 pawn, but once you make this target unattractive, white shouldn't do too bad. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I wasn't able to analyze it too deep, but maybe one of you can take up this challenge here and analyze it a bit and tell me the solution to this. But it looked quite interesting. So h3, e5. So finally black has achieved his desired break, a counter strike. And in general, if black comes and is able to play e5, and now you can already see the drawback of this move because the bishop is immediately hit. Otherwise, maybe something like d5 would be possible. Black simply equalize. General. Bishop h2 takes center, takes knight g5. Very, very strong. Also playing for simplifications. After takes, queen takes g5 and f4, which is kind of a weird move. I mean, of course, certainly white thinks he has the freedom to spend 2 tempi at least to bring this bishop back to life, and therefore for time being simply imprisons the bishop here. Looks quite anti-positional, and I'm not quite sure. First I thought, what about this? Of course, if king h1, it's just a pawn beam, just a pawn down. So the critical line probably goes here with queen takes d4, knight takes d4, goes there, and yeah, it's obvious that the knight controlling e2 is the only one, the only thing that saves the position. So that's unfortunately an idea which wouldn't work. So queen f6, queen goes back, otherwise she would be 1. d5, finally it comes, and now knight d5. And this knight is quite a powerful piece here. I mean, if we look at the bishops, this bishop here is blocked by its own pawns, so it's certainly a bad bishop. But also this bishop is certainly a bad bishop, which is it's quite uncommon to have 2 bad bishops. But I actually, to be honest, I didn't see such a position for quite a long time. But knight d4 comes now very strong, simply being superior to both of the bishops. And black's next idea is to play c5 to secure this post, this outpost for the knight. King h1, c5. Here it comes. Of course, if you take here, black can consider taking with pawn, with the idea of going c5 and then bishop e7. Or he can try to go with the knight there, and later on to play bishop e6 and maybe even for d5 push, putting one of the rooks on the d file and putting some pressure there. But I think a take with the bishop with the pawn is maybe a bit more natural. Okay, bishop d3, bishop d7. And the position was a bit Benoni type of position. So if you aren't unfamiliar with Benoni type of positions, black usually tries to play for b5, for the b5 break here, which is one of his typical way of creating counterplay. Because after b4, the knight has to go, and suddenly this diagonal becomes quite weak. Okay, bishop g1, finally one of the pieces is back in the game. Rook a to e8, queen d2, a6, and rook a to d1. So yeah, when I mentioned after c5 black's position is a bit better, I would say here it's black who's the only one playing for anything. I mean, if white is lucky, he can survive. Otherwise, I think it will just be crushed within a few moves. So I mean, okay, one idea was here maybe rook e7, but this gives actually white pretty good counterplay, because the rooks are needed. I mean, if white has to defend the position, and one mean of defending is to simplify the position, to get rid of some annoying piece pressure, which could be simply too much later on. So after d take e1, and if black stays with this concept, rook f to e1, a mass exchange here will simply give white probably quite good counterplay in the long run. So rook b8 is a very good decision, a very strong move, trying to play for the b5 push here, which is the common idea on top, yeah, one of the main plans in Benoni positions. And it would have been quite interesting to see rook e1 here, because like the engine tells me, I mean, a4 is just a bad move, because here in the case after b5, rook e3, b takes c4, bishop takes c4, it seems that yeah, white can maybe try to hold on here. I mean, it's still a bit worse, but it's not a catastrophe. And after a4, it suddenly becomes a catastrophe, because now comes a very strong move. This pawn is weak, this pawn is weak, and this pawn is weak. And one way to attack it is to play this queen maneuver here, which Carlsen immediately saw and started. Rook b1, queen a5, one step to go, rook queen d1, queen b4. And now you can see that actually a4 turns out to be a very, very serious weakness. Especially this bishop will never be able to take the knight because of the bishop takes or even pawn takes. This pawn loses its defender. So as you can see, even on the next 6 moves, or about 6 moves, doesn't alter the evaluation of the position and more actually increases black's advantage. Bishop f2, rook b8, the rook returns, queen b3. Our queen's exchange is quite good here. And this, I mean, usually you're told that when you're on the attack you shouldn't exchange queens, yeah? But this queen was actually, White's queen, was the main defender of this pawn on a4. Now there's some tactical trick, maybe luring in the room, you know, on this c3 knight and then picking up the pawn on a4. This is something that is not very, very serious. Bishop c2, knight a5, bishop d3, rook e3, rook d1, rook b8, which is not very good here. I mean, it's not obvious how black should proceed, so of course it's quite logical that Carlsen returns to the Meduni plan. But here, I mean, knight b3 is not very good because bishop f2 simply kicks the rook and makes the whole e-file unattractive. I mean, if you look at these bishops here, they control almost all squares and also these pawns, which prevent the penetration from black's rook along with these red squares. So the whole e-file is almost irrelevant here. Bishop c2, knight a5, bishop d3, bishop d4, king g1, and I think white's not doing not so bad here. The interesting idea was rook takes d3, which seemingly was also Carlsen's original idea. I mean, of course, it's quite complicated. An exchange is an exchange, but if the bishop goes to f6, black can try to set a similar scenario as we saw right now, because all those squares here are controlled, which makes the e-file also quite unattractive. So, and at least black can try to use the superior pieces to attack some weaknesses and to gain some weaknesses here and to win the pawns, because almost all his pawns are on light squares, which makes a defense of them quite difficult, especially without a light squared bishop. For example, if the rook takes d3, c4, knight takes c4 here. So after bishop f2, rook a to e8, now you finally see that this file is of no use, and I mean b5 does not come with such a power because of the rook a1, and if now b5, a takes b5 simply takes over the initiative. After this, going for something like that. And black isn't able to take over the initiative, for example, of knight e2, rook d1, again threatening to win the knight. It's a superior threat. Therefore, bishop d4, king g1. And yeah, to be honest, it's this very moment where even Carlsen was a bit low on time here, and suddenly Aronian felt that he at least was a bit back into the game. I mean, he had some counter chances. I mean, he prevented black's obvious plan of playing b5 because the knight is a problem piece there, and he can slowly start to get rid of some of the pressure. Maybe rook e to d1. Maybe somewhat trying to exchange off this piece here. Maybe something like g3, king g2, king f3, something improving the king, and slowly but surely trying to fix and to glue his position. Bishop e3, bishop takes, and now strong rook a to d1. He calculated quite well that b5 is now not very threatening. And the rook b8, king f2. White is ready to exchange off the rooks, after which the position is about equal, and the players soon agreed to a draw. And this bishop here might be passive, but it's also not clear how black will use this. I mean, this knight is also in a way dominated. All these light squares are not, he cannot access them, he cannot even retreat. So this knight is also certainly, stranded there, and after king e3, king f2, and g3, I think black cannot make any real progress. b5 is not possible, even with some of these pushes here. I think position remains about equal. So yeah, both players shake hands and agree to draw. Yeah, it started quite ambitiously by Carlsen, trying to imbalance the position from the very beginning. But unfortunately wasn't able to convert his advantage. So maybe this rook takes d3 exchange sacrifice here was the critical point where he let his advantage slip. Yeah, in my opinion, I mean, it might be possible if he had other ways to play on, but this looks like the most concrete and most direct way, and maybe even most logical way to convert the advantage which he accumulated. Okay. Well, if you have any comments, suggestions, or lines which I either calculated or miscalculated or assessed wrong, or I don't know, maybe even forgot, just leave a comment on my YouTube channel, and I try to reply as soon as possible. Otherwise, check out my website, www.dailychess.org. You can find some chess-related reviews there. And of course, it would be great if you could subscribe to my channel here on YouTube to follow me and to see once new and fresh video clips are released. Okay, otherwise, have a nice day. Bye.